Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, folks, wherever you are in the world, as our speaker is from down under, as they say. My name is Dr. Dwayne Quasey Wright. I am an assistant professor of higher education and administration, as well as director of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives here at the George Washington University. And I sit within the Graduate School of Education and Human Development. And George Washington is located in the nation's capital in the United States of America. And I've got to say that because, you know, there are more than just one America. We sort of forget that here in the States. In the early summer, in June of 2022, the Board of Trustees at the George Washington University decided to drop the name Colonials. George Washington University was founded as the Columbian College in 1821, but we had held the title Colonials since 1926. A particular type of colonization, settler colonialization, has become interesting over the last couple of months and definitely has become in the spotlight over the last couple of weeks. As our student Jennifer just alluded to, GW existed its own 16-day encampment, which many of the students were calling for an end to settler colonialism. In fact, our speaker today comes from the University of Melbourne, and the students there just ended a week-long occupation of the Arts West building, and in exchange for disclosure of university investments, also calling for an end to so-called settler colonialism. But what does settler colonialism mean? How do we distinguish it from other types of colonialism? And how does it impact our Western, Eastern, and the rest of our nations, whether it be in current conflicts, conflicts of before, or conflicts to come? And to discuss that, we have an expert here today, someone that I have admired for quite some time, and we are lucky to have Dr. Sarah Maddison with us. I will read her bio. Sarah Maddison is the professor of political science and director of the Australian Center. She calls it the so-called Australian Center at the University of Melbourne. She has published widely in the fields of reconciliation and intercultural relations, settler colonialism, the topic here today, Indigenous politics, gender politics, social movements, and democracy. In 2009, she was awarded the Churchill Fellowship to study models of Indigenous representation in the United States and Canada. She has recently published Public Policy, Indigenous Features, and the Handbook of Indigenous Public Policy, which was co-edited with Cheryl Lightfoot and Edward Elgar. She has published Conflict and Transformation and Reconciliation, and comparative research on South Africa, Northern Ireland, Australia, and Guatemala. Her book, Black Politics, Inside the Complexity of Aboriginal Politics and Culture, was published in 2009 and was the joint winner of the Henry Beyer Book Prize in 2009. Her other books, she has written a lot, include Beyond White Guilt, Unsettling the Settler State, and Silencing Dissent. In 2019, her book, The Colonial Fantasy, Why White Australia Can't Solve Black Problems, was published by Alling and Unwood. Dr. Maddison has been a visiting chair of politics at the University of Cape Town, has previously held visiting positions at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University, has been at the University of Connecticut, the University of Ulster as well, and of course comes to us early in the morning from the University of Melbourne. So Dr. Sarah Maddison, thank you for being with us. What do you mean by settler colonialism?
Thanks, Dwayne. That was, as always, a somewhat embarrassing introduction, but I thank you very much for your generosity and for finding me way down here, down under, as we do indeed say. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge country, which in the United States, I think you would call a land acknowledgement. It's a fundamental and foundational political protocol that informs the work that we do in the Australian Centre, but is quite common across Australia. So this morning, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Bunurong Bunurong people. I live about 90 minutes outside of Melbourne, down on the coast, on incredibly beautiful Bunurong country. I'd turn my computer around and show you, but then you'd lose all interest in what I have to say. And I also acknowledge the abiding sovereignty of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, who are the First Nation on whose land the Parkville campus, the main campus of the University of Melbourne, sits. So we understand our work in the Australian Centre through the lens of Indigenous sovereignties and what that means for all Australian politics today, which is a settler colonial state. And so that's my focus is going to be on the British settler colonies as a way of illustrating the theory that I'm going to unpack for you, but I'm sure we will get to other contexts in the Q&A. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Zoom's being very special this morning. Okay. So what indeed do we mean by settler colonialism? So I am going to break it down to some basics. I hope it's not too rudimentary, but I think it really helps to ensure that we have a shared language for what we're talking about this morning. So until the emergence of settler colonial theory, really in the late 90s, many efforts to understand what was happening politically between Indigenous and other peoples in places that we now call settler colonies were being pursued through the lens of post-colonial theory with some frustration. It was honestly, I think, a gift to have settler colonial theory emerge. We'll talk about some of those key theorists, but particularly in the work of Patrick Wolfe, who began to detail a particular form of colonization and colonialism that couldn't be explained by the kind of dominant theoretical and conceptual frameworks of the time. Patrick Wolfe, as I said, is a key theorist. His journal article, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Nation, the Native, is one of the kind of touch points in the field. He wrote that after a book that had a similar impact and is much cited, and we'll talk about some of that in a minute. That's not been unproblematic. Patrick Wolfe was a white man. He died sadly a few years ago. And he was at pains to always stress that he didn't create the field of settler colonial studies, that Indigenous scholars did that work. But nonetheless, he's often, I guess, understood as the father of the field. Other key theorists, two of whom are dear colleagues of mine, Lorenzo Veracini and Elizabeth Strakosch, have added greatly from the Australian perspective, but also from Lorenzo, very historically formed, and from Elizabeth, very theoretically informed. And then Keholani Kauanui is a Hawaiian scholar who really had a deep engagement with Patrick Wolfe's work. Her work is often read as a critique of his, but I think people who know her and understand her relationship to Patrick would say it was actually a gift to the field to try and tease out some of the challenges that were needed to be unpacked there. But the key insight from settler colonial theory that we began to understand during that period, and particularly so that Wolfe article I referenced was published in 2006, was that what was distinct about settler colonialism was that the settler always came to stay. The intent in establishing a settler colonial society was to establish a new society over the top of Indigenous polities. And that was distinct from other forms of colonization. Minute. Yes, we did jump a slide. No, we didn't. So distinct as a form of, sorry, I'm really having some tech problems. A form of colonialism, distinct in those ways. So if we break down these building blocks of imperialism, so the building and expansion of empire, mostly European nations stretching out across the world to claim territory for themselves, with a particular intent on accumulating resources, giving rise to practices of colonization and colonialism, in which I guess you could say that the common factor is the establishment of a society in which the new arrivals dominate, set up a system of power and institutions that dominates another group. And usually this is the mother country establishing an outpost. And those institutions, that inequality that's embedded in colonial institutions has, as you would observe around the world, often survived periods of structural decolonisation. And that structural decolonisation has been possible because in those cases where structural decolonisation has occurred, and by that I mean where the coloniser has basically packed up and gone home, the intent of the colonial project was not to establish a new society, but was to extract the resources of that territory. So those resources might be minerals in the ground, it might be land for agriculture, it might be the bodies and labour of enslaved people. But the extraction was the core intent of the colonial project, not the establishment of a new society, which is, as I'll come to unpack a little more, what makes settler colonialism distinct. Interestingly, I think colonialism was completely legal under international law. It is no longer considered so, but it was completely legal under international law with particular doctrines that guided that, and most notably the doctrine of discovery. And Australia is one such example where it was treated as though this continent was terra nullius, treated as though there was nobody here, which of course wasn't true, but in acting as though this was an empty land, the British could claim that they discovered it and therefore justify their ongoing colonisation. What is distinct then in the settler colonial project is the fact that the colonies, in establishing a new society over the top of an Indigenous society, are left with a problem. If you deny, in a terra nullius case, if you deny that Indigenous peoples even exist, and yet Indigenous peoples persist and clearly do exist, you're left with a problem around legitimacy. And so one of the key logics that I'm going to talk about this morning is what Patrick Wolfe called the logic of elimination, that the drive behind settler colonialism was not just to take territory, but was to eliminate and replace the existing population of that territory. So Indigenous peoples weren't viewed only as a source of cheap labour, although they certainly were used for cheap labour in, vast swathes of the Australian continent, but that wasn't the primary intent. Indigenous peoples then, and particularly their political orders. So Indigenous people are not targeted for elimination as individual people, but as peoples. So the desire is to eliminate the entirety of the political order, another sovereignty that competes with the sovereignty of the colonist. When we often talk about the Kansas states, so the British settler colonies, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States, these societies, so your country, my country, must continue to dispossess Indigenous peoples from their land and to deny Indigenous sovereign authority if our state formations are to continue as the colonists, the settler colonists, the logic of settler colonialism would prefer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, more about this logic of elimination in a minute, how that feeds into what's referred to as the desire for colonial completion, and then look at how that plays out a little through the lens of policy and race. So perhaps the most quoted line from Patrick Wolfe is his argument that invasion is a structure, not an event. And for most Australians raised in, educated in a system that teaches a very limited view of history, most of us grew up being taught that colonisation was something that happened a long time ago. It's not something that's ongoing in the present. And so Wolfe really helped us to see how invasion has been structured into the everyday operation of a settler colony like Australia. So founded through violence, the settler state then invests in sustaining that colonial order through the structuring of institutions and practices that maintain inequalities and injustice. This is obviously deeply bound up with this logic of elimination, but it points to the fact that for Indigenous people in the Kansas states and elsewhere in the world, invasion happens every day. You know, in the Australian case, where British colonists have been on this continent for, 230 odd years, it's, I think, akin to waking up every day and finding that if you're an Indigenous person, finding that your land is still occupied by the invaders who arrived a couple of generations ago. And that is obviously a very damaging dynamic. And I guess key to this idea is the fact that because the settler state can't pack up and go home, and I think that is widely accepted, it's not as though the continent that is now called Australia can ever rid itself of the more recent arrivals, bearing in mind that Indigenous people have lived on this continent for 60,000 plus years. It's one of the oldest living society on the culture on the planet. But the settler is now here to stay, as settler colonial theory would have us understand. Settler states like the Kansas states have not decolonized, and importantly, cannot decolonize, cannot become post-colonial, which again reinforces this idea that invasion has been structured into every element of our social and political life. So this is what leads us to thinking more deeply about this logic of elimination. And I think that language that Wolf chose, a logic, is important. It isn't as though there are a group of evil white people sitting in back rooms plotting how to further target the elimination of Indigenous peoples, although I would suggest that those people do exist, but I don't think very many of them have been elected in Australia. But it's in seeking to permanently displace the Indigenous populations that drives this logic that informs every aspect of the way the settler state works. And I think this is an incredibly useful insight, because I think we can all see and recognise elimination in its more violent forms. Frontier warfare, for example, that took place across this continent for over 100 years, clearly targeted the elimination of Indigenous peoples. But there are other much more subtle ways in which Indigenous peoples can be eliminated. So in Australia, we had a long period of assimilation policy where there was an overtly expressed desire to draw Indigenous peoples into the mainstream settler body politic. That was suggested as being in the best interest of Indigenous people, is that they become more like the settler. Child removal policies were a part of that. So Indigenous children, and particularly lighter skinned Indigenous children, were targeted for removal from their families because they could be more easily assimilated into the mainstream population. So that is another way of eliminating the native, is to actually make them more like the settler. And others would also argue that even policies like reconciliation that appear to be about creating a more just and equal relationship, when understood through this logic of elimination, can be seen as actually a technique of helping the state to become more post-colonial in the way that it understands itself. I'm going to talk about this desire for colonial completion, I think, on the next slide. So through reconciliation, again, the Indigenous political autonomy, Indigenous sovereignty seeks to be absorbed into the nation state. And this logic is not just an occasional or an accidental thing. Through the structures, the invasion of structure, elimination then becomes the organising principle of settler colonialism. And you can, for me, really grappling with this idea was one of those kind of scales falling from my eyes moments where suddenly when you see the logic of elimination at work, you see it everywhere. You see it in all kinds of policies, in education policies, in health policies, in criminal justice policies, particular, that the native Indigenous peoples are still being targeted for elimination through a subtle logic. The drive behind this logic of elimination is what we call the desire for colonial completion, or what elsewhere I've called the colonial fantasy. So settlers everywhere, I think, are quite anxious about the moral illegitimacy of the colonial project. And so there's a desire for a settler colonial society like Australia to relegate that discomfort to the past, to say, yeah, sure, invasion wasn't great, colonization was, probably immoral, but we've moved beyond that now. We can put that idea in the past. I would say that the Australian education system actively educates people to think that way. But that anxiety persists because, none of us are blind, and we can see the ways in which First Nations continue to be excluded, marginalised, targeted for elimination in all kinds of ways. But as settler settler colonial states continued to think of themselves as moving inevitably towards this time when it can think of itself in different ways. And this leads to a complex temporality, so a complex thinking about our place in time. So on the one hand, we want to understand that colonialism is in the past, that it was a sad thing that happened, but ultimately it benefited everyone. And you still hear particularly more conservative politicians in Australia say that colonisation benefited Indigenous people here. But this idea of completing the colonial project is seen as an inevitable future state, but it's always just out of reach. It's what Strakosch and McCann, who I've cited there, call the vanishing endpoint of settler colonialism. There's this view that if we just do the next thing, if we just, as there was an effort to do, recognise First Nations in the Constitution of Australia, then that would make us post-colonial, and then we can relegate that unpleasant, violent period to the past and reimagine ourselves as post-colonial and morally good. So one way in particular that we can see these logics play out in the logic of elimination and this desire for colonial completion is through policy, which is, often not thought of as the most sexy area of political science necessarily, but if we think of policy as a site of profound political conflict and political engagement, I think it takes on a different lens. So scholars like Liz Strakosch would argue that because all settler policy is premised on this logic of elimination that is imbued throughout settler colonial societies, even the policy approaches that seem benevolent or progressive, as I've suggested around reconciliation policy, are in fact extending that logic of elimination. And the state in this way cannot be the neutral agent that it imagines itself to be. So bureaucrats around the world think of themselves as being politically neutral and just working for the good of all people through the political authority that's granted to them through a democratic election. And this is an attempt to naturalise colonial authority over Indigenous lives. It's rare to hear anyone other than Indigenous activists and some scholars question the legitimacy of the state to make policy for and about Indigenous people. That's a problem because it completely skips over the questions around sovereignty and, of course, around self-determination, which is recognised in international law. And so this act of asserting that Indigenous peoples are the legitimate subjects of domestic policy is bound up with this desire for colonial completion. Acting upon Indigenous people as subjects of domestic policy allows the settler state to demonstrate its colonial sovereign authority. And in turn, what that leads to is this constant churn and reinvention in Indigenous policy, particularly when we connect this to the desire for colonial completion. So as the state continues to pursue this aspiration of understanding itself as post-colonial, it pursues policy that it thinks will get to that end. And of course it doesn't, because it leaves unaddressed the foundational political conflict, which is between sovereigns. Australia certainly cannot engage with that question, and we can talk, I think, the US experience has been markedly different, but in Australia we can't even use the word Indigenous sovereignty if it comes into contact with domestic policy in any way. So there's this constant churn and reinvention of the state thinking, well, what about? Well, what about? Well, what about? And again, it's this vanishing endpoint of settler colonialism. If we try this, if we do this, we'll, the main policy focus nationally in Australia in relation to Indigenous people is what's called closing the gap. So the focus is on closing the statistical differences in education, health, justice, child mortality, a whole range of statistical indicators. And that, again, is focusing on those policy approaches is a way of attempting to achieve this idea of colonial completion, that if we can just get to statistical equality between First Nations and other people in Australia, then surely we'll be post-colonial then, and we can feel good about ourselves. So policy is an important way in which the logic of elimination and the desire for colonial completion are pursued in settler colonial societies. We can't, I think, talk about settler colonialism without talking about race, although I will say, I think, in Australia in particular, conversations about race are marginalised. We don't have good language and discourse around race. But one of the things that settler colonial theory and this relatively new way of thinking about relations between First Nations and the state did over the last few decades is change some of the grammar in when we talk about race. So through the 1970s, when Australia's multicultural policy was first a part of the political lexicon here, Indigenous people were considered and treated as just another minority in a liberal multicultural society. And it's been through Indigenous assertions that have, never paused, Indigenous assertions of their abiding sovereignty, Indigenous contestation of the sovereign authority of the colonial state, and an assertion of Indigenous blackness here. So in Australia, Indigenous people are racialised as both Indigenous and black, which is a difference, I think, compared to the US, where, the kind of hot button race issue relates to, African Americans, formerly enslaved people, Black Lives Matter. That's the kind of heat in the racialised discourse. In Australia, that's all targeted at Indigenous people. Blackness and indigeneity are kind of fused, and that creates a very, very complex environment for Indigenous political actors in this continent. Recognising, of course, that indigeneity and Aboriginality are themselves colonial constructs. There were no Indigenous people on this continent before the arrival of the colonists. There were several hundred First Nations, often very small, but First Nations who had lived on this continent for tens of thousands of years before they became Indigenous with the arrival of the British, created a different political order. And those racialised identities were absolutely tied into the logic of elimination. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on this continent were racialised in language that's probably familiar in the US around degrees of blood. So this is incredibly racist language to even use these days, but from full blood on. And as I said, that those different categories of Indigenous people were then targeted for elimination in different ways, particularly through child removal. So Patrick Wolfe has argued that race is colonialism speaking. It's definitely a technology of settler colonialism that seeks to continue to marginalise and oppress First Nations people and targeting them for elimination. So in the complexity of that situation then, how do we understand who a settler is? And why do we even talk about settlers? What is the usefulness of that term? So these two Canadian scholars, non-Indigenous Canadian scholars, Emma Battle-Lohman and Adam Barker, suggest that we need a term that can help us see ourselves for who we are, not just who we claim to be. And we need to understand our own complicity and the ways in which we are all a part of the colonial project, and the ways in which we relate to systems of power and land and the people on whose territory our country exists. So in Australia, the idea of settlerness is often bound up with whiteness, and one of the questions I'm asked most frequently is, what about more recent migrants? What about people who've come to Australia in the last 100 years? And of course, they're all settlers too. Anyone who chooses to live on stolen land has to understand that they are a settler, which isn't to say that they are a unified class of people. Obviously, settlerness and its benefits accrue differently to different subgroups within the population, where skin colour is relevant, and by class, gender and sexuality, among other things. So a diverse and multi-ethnic group, but that nonetheless shares in common the fact that they benefit from the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands in a multitude of ways, and are complicit in sustaining colonial relationships. So just one last slide on the critiques of settler colonial theory. So in as much as I find the settler colonial theoretical framework articulated by Wolfe and many others incredibly useful in thinking about the politics of a place like Australia, there certainly have been critiques. So a key one is that in emphasising the structural nature of settler colonialism, in insisting that that invasion has been structured into the everyday functioning of a settler colonial society, Kehaulani Kauanui has suggested that this overlooks Indigenous agency and resistance, that in as much as invasion has been structured into settler colonial society, that is met by an indigeneity that is itself enduring. And in the face of this being targeted for elimination, Indigenous peoples continue to exist, resist, and persist. And so there's an important reminder there in engaging in this field that settler colonial studies must not overshadow Indigenous studies, that these two theoretical frames are incredibly important to knit together in the way that we think about settler colonial societies. The emphasis on structure may also suggest that the existing relationships between Indigenous peoples and the settler state are inevitable, that they can't change. And again, when that's met with the persistent and consistent assertions by First Nations people of their abiding sovereignty, and the ways in which that those assertions of sovereignty continue to destabilise and discomfort the settler colonial order, then I think that gives weight to, I think, Lorenzo Veracini's very nice framing that although it might be overly structural in its articulation, we also need to understand that structures can be torn down. There is nothing inevitable about settler colonialism. It can be disrupted, and it can be, I think we are limited in Australia definitely by a failure of imagination to imagine a society differently. Wolfe expressed something similar when he talks about the return of the repressed, whereby the logic of elimination marks a return through it, whereby the native repressed continues to structure settler colonial society. So as I've argued elsewhere, it's only through Indigenous resistance and refusal of the state that the structures of settler colonialism can even come into view. And it's these structures that must be contested. So I will end that here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maddison. That